One more NFL team chose their next head coach today, and no, it was not the Seattle Seahawks. It was the Tennessee Titans hiring Brian Callahan, not a candidate that the Seahawks were interested in. But with news coming out over the weekend that the Seahawks have lined up at least 5 more second interviews, or at least put in requests for them, what does it tell us about their search, and how does it impact my top 5? I gave you my initial one after Pete Carroll was relieved of his duties a week and a half ago. I will update my top 5 favorite coaching candidates for the Seahawks, tell you why I feel that way, up next today on Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
Before we get started, do all the things. Hit that like button and the bell button on YouTube so you get notification of new episodes. And, of course, subscribe to the channel if you would, please. If you prefer audio episodes, you can subscribe on any podcast platform. And you can listen on Spotify without ads for just 99 cents a month. That subscription link is in that link is in the description of this video on YouTube. And if you just want to support the show, you like what I do, you can buy me a coffee or a beer. That link will be down there as well. We have breaking news of sorts in the NFL today. One more head coaching position has been filled. Brian Callahan, the offensive coordinator with Cincinnati Bengals, who was not really on the public radar or really even the media's radar when the coaching cycle started this offseason. But he got a number of interviews, and the Titans decided to go with him. No doubt for the work that he did with Joe Burrow in Cincinnati. They like what he did there. And with a young quarterback in place there in Will Levis, they were certainly looking for someone to come along and groom him as well. So Brian Callahan joins Antonio Pierce and Gerard Mayo in Vegas and New England as head coaches, all first-time head coaches, a definite trend so far in those first 3 jobs. Is that the way the Seahawks will go? It's the way a lot of you want them to go. We love the allure of the unknown, don't we? And stick around till the end, because I'm going to touch on the idea that resume doesn't always equate to how good a head coach is going to be. Just for a quick teaser, of the 4 teams left in the conference championship games, the final 4 in the NFL that have a shot at the Super Bowl, still 3 of those head coaches did not, never had any experience as a primary play caller. Interesting, right? And there are some candidates that fit that bill here. And so I just want to kind of dispel some of the concerns, potentially, that one equates to the other. Because thoughts and opinions are all over the board out there among fans. I see it on social media every day. Some of you are absolutely convinced that you know who the next head coach should be and shouldn't be. That you know. And I've seen it all over the board. Some of you are convinced Dan Quinn, they should go with Dan Quinn and stick with that culture, that he'd be a good CEO type leader in that locker room, a leader of men. KJ Wright has endorsed him. A lot of ex-players have. And then there are those of you that look at the way that Cowboys defense finished the season and think he'd be a terrible choice. Some of you have very, very strong feelings about some of these young, green candidates that really don't have a lot of experience in a leadership position. Bobby Slowick's an example. Only 1 year as a play caller. None of you knew who he was until this year. And yet some of you have told me in no uncertain terms that you know that he has to be the hire. Otherwise, John Schneider has screwed this whole thing up. And then there's a lot of gray area in between. And as I study this and try to read the tea leaves and connect the dots, my opinions have changed a little bit on some of these guys. I'm going to show that to you today. There are 5 job openings left: Atlanta, Washington, Carolina, the LA Chargers, and Seattle. 3 of those 5 have been heavily reported as strongly leaning towards one candidate. In Atlanta, we know that Bill Belichick has had 2 interviews. We have heard that Arthur Blank wants him in no uncertain terms to be their next head coach. He hasn't really been that attached to any other jobs. There's been some reporting that Belichick wants that job. And yet the Falcons have interviewed and continue to interview. They've submitted the most requests of any team out there, 15. And they still are doing second interviews with other candidates, despite Belichick having already completed his second interview. Not sure what's going on there. Similar situation in LA, where Jim Harbaugh has, from the very beginning of this process, been the favorite to go to LA. He is on the record as saying years ago how much he loves Justin Herbert and would like to work with him. He has done 2 interviews there. There have been reports that that's the job he wants. They want him, and yet they continue to interview other candidates when he's not bound. Neither's Bill Belichick, as someone who's been fired. These guys aren't bound by some of the restrictions on when you can interview candidates because they're not under contract with other NFL teams. They could be hired today, as Brian Callahan was. Interesting situations there. And then the Commanders, much to most of your chagrin from what I base your opinions to be on social media, have been tied to Ben Johnson from the very beginning of this process as well, the Detroit Lions offensive coordinator. And they've submitted the least amount of requests for coaching interviews, which would lead to even more speculation that they've zeroed in on Johnson, that Adam Peters, really the new GM there, comes from the San Francisco Giants or the San Francisco 49ers. It's not baseball season yet. Comes from their organization, highly thought of, highly respected, new ownership group there that people are raving about. And there are some that assume that it's just a matter of time that Ben Johnson is going to Washington. And then there's the Panthers, who there's a lot of assumptions that nobody wants to work for them. They were really interested in Brian Callahan, but he chose to take the Titans job. I wonder if that tells you what he thinks of the 2 quarterbacks there. That maybe it's not just David Tepper that is scaring candidates off in Carolina. It's as they have predominantly interviewed mostly offensive or more offensive coordinators than defensive coordinators there. Maybe they're not huge fans of Bryce Young. But anyway, the Panthers, with Callahan out, they have requested second interviews with 2 candidates on the Seahawks list for second interviews. Ajiro Aviro and Raheem Morris. So the Seahawks, where are they at? A lot of you have grown frustrated with how long this is taking, and I get it. We want answers. We want to know who the head coach is because it's going to tell us a lot more. It's going to tell us, we'll start to learn who the staff is. What direction are they going to go on defense? What scheme are they going to run? What direction are they going to go on offense? Is it someone that might tip the organization's hand as to whether they want to target a young quarterback and start over at that position a little bit, or at least groom somebody there? Is it a 3-4 guy? Is it a 4-3 guy? We just want to know. But this process is going to take some time. And the good news is everyone's bound by the same rules. You know, if the Seahawks really want Ben Johnson, and based on the rules now, they could interview him a second time virtually next week if they win during the Super Bowl bye week. And if they lose, if they get eliminated, they could interview him then a second time, but in person. But it's hands off this week. Don't know yet if they've put in a request for a second interview with him or with Bobby Slowick. And then there's some mystery surrounding some names as well, right? When Tom Pelissero reported the 5 names that the Seahawks have asked to interview a second time, it was with the disclaimer that there will likely be more names added to that. That wasn't a comprehensive list. It wasn't a final list. It might be, but it's possible that it's not also. Let me show you, first of all, before I get into my updated list, let me show you what I did the first time. Hang on. Got to do a little tech here. So here was my list initially. My favorite candidate, as many of you also agree, Ben Johnson. It's not just what he's done with that offense in Detroit and how similar the personnel would seem to be. Seahawks need to plug a few pieces in on the offensive line to get anywhere near the level of the Detroit Lions, but there's some potential there, right? If Abe Lucas is healthy, you can make a case that center, 2 tackles, pretty good shape, depending on how you feel about Oluwatimi at center. There's some potential there at guard with Anthony Bradford, McClendon Curtis, a young guy that they carried on the team all year long, even though he was never active. There's some pieces there, but certainly that'll be something they go out and address in the offseason as well. But you look at the running backs the Seahawks have and the receivers and a guy like Geno Smith, and you compare him to, you look at what Ben Johnson's done with Jared Goff in Detroit and then watch his demeanor. I spent a lot of time this week watching coaching interviews to get a feel for this stuff. He just screams head coach. And he just seems like a guy that John Schneider would absolutely want. One thought about Johnson is this. If there isn't a second interview, it could mean one of two things. It could just mean that John Schneider and he didn't click. He just didn't feel like he had the vision that he was looking for in a head coach. But it also could be that he just doesn't get the sense that he's interested in taking the job here. John Schneider is as tied in around the league with his ear to the ground as anyone. We see it on draft day. How many times has he traded down knowing that he could still get the guy that he wanted? Or we hear stories of, the national media thinks the Seahawks reached on a player, come to find out that other teams were looking at taking that player directly after the Seahawks. Because he has a lot of connections. He has a lot of friendships in the league. He has a lot of trust built up, a lot of equity, and he's able to get that information. Let's go back to my first list. Mike Vrabel, number 2 on this list. I just think he's the closest thing out there to the Dan Campbell mold of really creating an attitude in that locker room and a mindset and a culture that guys are going to play hard. Dan Quinn, I put it number 3 here. Concerns from a lot of you, me too, about how his defenses paired against better offenses this year, about what the 49ers did to him, about how they finished the season, about what the Packers did to him. But I think it's fair. It's fair. You can make a case that he'd be a better head coach than some fans think he would be based on how he performed as a defensive coordinator. And still across the board, his last 3 years in Dallas is top 10, sometimes top 5 defense. How quickly we forget how bad the Seahawks defense is and how much better it might be if we had a little bit of what Dallas had going on this year, right? So here's my number 3. I've always thought, a month ago, I would have thought if you told me Pete Carroll was getting fired, I would have thought Dan Quinn. That's going to be an easy choice. Not so sure now. Number 4, Bobby Slowick. Texans bounced out of the playoffs, but that performance against Cleveland, what he did with that offense, especially with explosive plays against that defense, was impressive. And just what he did all season long. How much he got out of CJ Stroud as a rookie. I'm not sure about the demeanor. You watch interviews with him. He's incredibly bright. You read stories about how he reacts to things during the game and adjusts during the game, bounces things off Stroud, notices little tiny details, things the defense is doing and figures out how to pick on that. it'd be fun to see him operate an offense with a good running game. I mean, when Devin Singletary is really your only option at running back, I mean, Dameon Pierce, don't know what happened to him this year, but give him a better offensive line and a dynamic running game, and that could be fun to watch. And then Mike Macdonald, who has done such incredible things in the 2 years that he's coordinated the defense with the Baltimore Ravens. We saw it again this weekend. You know, they're really impressive, and how he varies his game plan from week to week and adjusts during the game, disguises things, how hard those teams play and how well they tackle. And yet he has yet to even interview with the Seahawks. And that's where some of the mystery comes into play. Vrabel and McDonald are interesting to me. Two very different cases. McDonald can't be hired right now. He has interviewed virtually for some other jobs. It was reported immediately, one of the first names to come out after Carroll was fired. There were reports that the Seahawks were interested in interviewing Mike Macdonald. And we were just waiting. This is before any of the requests were reported, when the Seahawks were still in that phase of where they had to post the job and work through some of that red tape. And yet here we are a week and a half later and nothing yet. No Mike Macdonald. And because they didn't interview him by the deadline yesterday, they can't now. Not this week anyway. Does Mike Macdonald not like the West Coast? I think he interviewed with the Chargers. He's interviewed with 3 teams, I believe. Is there some reason that he just doesn't think this is an attractive job? Is there something about him that Schneider doesn't like? Find it hard to believe. Guy seems to really conduct himself well in interviews. Players certainly play hard for him, respect him. He worked his way up through that one organization. That's what kind of is different about him. A lot of these other candidates have bounced around a lot. Not him. 7 years with the Ravens, worked his way up, got his shot as DC after Wink Martindale was fired, and has made the most of it. Don't know what's up there. I don't know what's up. It could just be that Schneider doesn't feel like he has to hurry because he thinks the Ravens are going to go to the Super Bowl, and so the rest of us. He doesn't have to make that decision today. He also might be surveying the lay of the land, as I just did. When you start to play process of elimination, if Belichick goes to Atlanta, Harbaugh goes to LA, the Commanders hire Ben Johnson, that leaves the Seahawks and the Panthers for all the other candidates. Who are you going to work for? David Tepper? With how much he gets his hands in on things and how impatient he is. And, that just sounds like a shit show down there in Carolina. So it basically, it's possible that's what that's where his head is at. We don't have to hurry. It's us against Carolina. And nobody knows that organization better from the outside or has an ear to the ground on what's going on there potentially than John Schneider, because Scott Fitterer worked for him for years before he got the GM job there. One of his closest friends in the business fired there last month as GM. Hey, John, no one wants to work there. Nobody wants to coach in Carolina. Very, very interesting way to look at it. It's quite possible at the end of the day that Mike Macdonald's the guy that John Schneider really wants. And he's slow playing this because he knows he can. We also know that they can talk to agents. Maybe there's been an indication there. Hey, just, he's going to go through some motions. He's going to take a couple of Zoom interviews. But let's not get too deep into this until it's all done. It's possible. The only reason he's 5 or was 5 on my initial list and not higher was because there had been no request for an interview. But if I find out tomorrow that he's interested in the job, he shoots up this list, maybe all the way to number 1, because I just don't, as much as we all want Ben Johnson, I think he's gone. I think he's going to Washington. Still my number 1 guy, just because I think he'd be the best fit, but you can't make someone want to coach for you. So here's my update based on all that stuff I just talked about. Slightly different. Ben Johnson's still my number one guy because I think if he's announced as a head coach tomorrow, which obviously can't happen, but just hypothetically, I think Seahawk fans almost to a person are cheering because of what they know about Ben Johnson, what they see in the performance of his offenses on the field with the Detroit Lions. Number 2, I cheated a little bit. And again, this is this is who I would want, not who I think is going to get the job. Talk about that in another episode. You're getting 2 for 1 today. It's Vrabel and McDonald. I just think those guys make a lot of sense for different reasons. Vrabel, to me, it's more about personality and his ability to manage a staff. As a guy who's a former coordinator and worked his way up through the coaching ranks, linebacker coach and then coordinator, he's pretty hands-off. He lets coordinators do their thing, and he's had some pretty good success identifying guys, putting guys in position to succeed and allowing them to do that. I just like his attitude. Man, Google Mike Vrabel or YouTube Mike Vrabel, it sucks to lose, and see the little rant he went on the last week of the season when someone had the audacity to ask him, what's your motivation for trying to win this game when the season's over? You don't have a shot at the playoffs. It's awesome. It's everything. It's the way you want your head coach to react. And then McDonald for his performance with the Ravens. But I should have put an asterisk on that because neither of those guys have been interviewed. Vrabel's the other mystery. There was some momentum 4 or 5 days ago where every significant national NFL reporter was trying to make connections. Peter King and Albert Breer, and Rich Eisen and Pelissero, all these guys. Vrabel, Florio. Vrabel to Seattle makes so much sense. I mean, Peter King in back-to-back days went on the Dan Patrick show and the Mike Florio show and said, I don't understand why he hasn't interviewed there yet. But here's the thing. Maybe he has. We know the Seahawks like to keep things close to the vest. They're better at most organizations at keeping things quiet. Mike Vrabel's not under contract with anyone. Doesn't have to be requested. He could have already interviewed with the Seahawks, and we wouldn't even know it. Number 3, Mike Kafka is my late riser. Let me talk about Kafka for a minute. Offensive coordinator with the New York Giants. And you might think, oh, man, really? This last year? Really? Here's the thing about Mike Kafka. When you look at the entirety of his background, let's work backwards. This year, the Giants are ravaged by injury. Saquon Barkley missed a couple of games again, and when he came back, that high ankle sprain, he wasn't himself. Took a while to get back to 100%. I don't think their wide receiver group there is anything to really get excited about. And then he starts the season with Daniel Jones. He gets hurt, misses the whole season. They go with Tommy DeVito and Tyrod Taylor. So they finish 18th in yards per game. This year, they just weren't good. But in 2022, there were some things that you could kind of pin your hat on a little bit. 2022, they were middle of the pack, 18th in yards per game, but they were 4th in rushing yards per game. They ran the football well with Saquon. Big year for him. They were 16th in the league, right in the middle in points per game, but they were 9th in EPA per play, both running and passing. Top 10 offense in expected points per play, both run and pass. Better than maybe you think they are, and got a good enough year out of Daniel Jones that the Giants didn't look for other quarterback options and gave him $40 million a year. But this is what I look at. Remember, before that, he came up under Andy Reid in Kansas City. And in 2020, Eric Bieniemy was still there with the offensive coordinator title. But Kafka was quarterback coach and passing game coordinator. 2020, obviously, Kansas City Chiefs, number 1 passing offense in the league. 2021, the number 4 passing offense in the league. And back then, the rules were a little bit looser. Teams could be a little more aggressive in blocking other teams. Philadelphia Eagles wanted to hire Mike Kafka, who played for them for a short time in his career. Wanted to hire him as offensive coordinator, and the Chiefs, even though he was only a quarterback coach at the time, blocked him, wouldn't let him interview, thought that highly of him. He was at one time a rising star. And I say that because, well, let me get back to my list, and then we're going to come around and tie in that thought that I promised you at the top of the show. Here's the rest of my list. Dan Quinn moves down slightly to 4, and Raheem Morris at 5. And then I've got a couple honorable mentions because it was really close. I could have gone 7 or 8 on this list. It's hard to separate these guys. There is a lot to like about both Quinn and Morris in the sense that I think they would come with a pretty strong idea of who their staff would be. And there are some very intriguing possibilities. Dan Quinn, you're talking about, well, who's going to run the offense? And the defense is going to have to hire a coordinator, right? But on offense, he has worked with some really intriguing coordinators. I think I've talked about it already in the show, but Kellen Moore would be the first name that I would hope would come with him. You can say he didn't do a great job with the Chargers this year, but again, Justin Herbert played hurt the whole year, missed some time, missed the last few games at the end of the year, and yet they were able to get a pretty serviceable performance from Easton Stick. And then you look at his offenses in Dallas for 3 years, and they were top 5. And he was considered one of the hot, sharp, smart young minds in the league. I think Mike McCarthy got rid of him because of ego. You know, said some stuff about how he wasn't running the football enough, but how'd that Dallas running game look this year, huh? No, it was all about Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb and those weapons, Jake Ferguson. And I think it was just ego. The kid was getting too much credit. And then Raheem Morris, if you were to be the guy, first of all, I've got Morris on this list where I didn't on my first list just because, I mean, people rave about him. His defenses really historically haven't been great, although the work he did with that young roster around Aaron Donald this year, one that most of us thought wasn't going to be very good, actually was very commendable. But his energy, his presence behind the podium, how much players love him, and also, again, some of his connections on offense. There are some dudes working under Sean McVay right now, which traditionally has been a pretty good thing for your resume, that are enticing. You know, Mike LaFleur is his offensive coordinator, and LaFleur is a guy that 3 years ago, again, he and Mike McDaniel, coming from that Shanahan tree in San Francisco, were two of the hottest names for young coordinators to get jobs that offseason. McDaniel went straight to being a head coach. LaFleur goes to New York, has a terrible rookie quarterback with Zach Wilson, and gets fired, becomes a scapegoat, but was, again, one of the rising stars 3 years ago. A guy that McVay trusts to the point that in week 18, I believe it was this year, let him call the plays. Don't give up on Mike LaFleur. I think there's still a great offensive coordinator potentially in there. Is that a guy that Morris would want to bring with him? Or Zach Robinson, who has the quarterback coach title there. I think offensive passing game coordinator as well. He's getting tons of interviews around the league right now for offensive coordinator positions. Could it be Zach Robinson? There's always someone coming out of that McVay family, right? Honorable mention. Some guys you might wonder why I'm not naming. Bobby Slowick, I just can't figure out. I don't know. Again, we all think we know, but we don't. It's 1 year. They didn't run the ball well. He's so hard to gauge personality-wise. I'm just not sure. I think if you hire Bobby Slowick and friend of the show and personal friend Michael Thompson from 12th Man Rising is firmly on the Bobby Slowick train and tossed the idea to me today of pairing him with a veteran defensive coordinator, specifically Ron Rivera, someone that I opined on Twitter after he was fired in Washington would be a good candidate to do that, even if Pete had stayed, provided they were going to pressure him, strongly suggest that he bring in an autonomous defensive coordinator, which there's some reporting that was discussed in those meetings before he was let go. Wasn't sure if he wanted to coach again, but now he is reportedly being targeted by the Eagles and is interested in continuing coaching. Someone like that, right? Like when Sean McVay was hired at such a young age with the Rams, the story goes that he was in the interview with Les Snead and called Wade Phillips on his phone and said, "Here's my DC. He's going to come with me." Wanted that veteran presence in the locker room. I think you'd have to do that with Slowick. And then Ejiro Evero continues to be part of this process, is getting a second interview. There is the Scott Fitterer connection. And the way people rave about this guy, just how good of a teacher he is, and how he's produced a couple good defenses on bad teams. So that's my list. And I had promised a little context on my Mike Kafka ranking before I finish up. And it's this, because I just have a gut feeling as I watch interviews with Kafka and even watched a video that, our old friend Matty Brown of the Seattle Overload podcast did a breakdown a year ago about what a brilliant play caller Mike Kafka appeared to be. That some of you might look at his resume, you might look at what he's doing with the Giants and be unimpressed. And even look at his Kansas City experience and think, well, but he wasn't the guy. Andy Reid calls plays, Bieniemy's coordinating the offense. He shouldn't get too much credit for that. I'm going to give you a couple of resumes here. How about one guy, candidate A, was an offensive coordinator for one season, but didn't call plays. Then the next season went to another team, had the OC title, called plays, and his offense finished 25th in the NFL in yards per game and 27th in points per game. That's candidate A. Candidate B had one season, partial season, where he was promoted to offensive coordinator to call plays when the incumbent guy was fired, called plays for 5 games. During those 5 games, their team averaged 17 points per game. And then he spent a year in college as an OC and then was a quarterback coach with another team and didn't have any say in calling plays. Candidate A was Matt LaFleur. Candidate B, Zach Taylor. So if the Seahawks announce a hiring tomorrow, if they announce it's Bobby Slowick or Mike Kafka, and you think they've shown us nothing, neither did Matt LaFleur or Zach Taylor. This is all about vision and how bright you are, how you can lead men, how you can impress in interviews, how you can lay out a plan. It's not always about resume. If it was resume, why is Eric Bieniemy not getting any interviews any longer? Something about that guy that's turned teams off. He's not even getting a shot this year. Just wanted to throw that out there in the event that it is one of those guys, because I'm coming off of Slowick. Obviously, he's dropped off my top 5, and I'm on to Kafka. Just a gut feeling. I just kind of feel like he could be Zach Taylor. Because here's the other thing about LaFleur and Taylor. When you look at, they've gotten a little bit more commanding as they've gotten wiser and more experienced. But man, they didn't win their press conferences. They didn't blow you away with their dynamic personalities the way McVay did when he was hired, or the way Campbell did. I'm talking about biting kneecaps, right? It's not always about personality. I've had to remind myself of that. Watch a Kyle Shanahan interview. Snoozer. So just some stuff to keep in mind. And then I have another thought that some information that I just discovered in the last couple of hours that has led me to a significant dark horse in this race that might be coming around the turn and making up ground and coming on fast based on some insider information. So stay tuned for that. You're going to get 2 shows today. In the meantime, please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button on whichever platform you listen to or watch, and follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever and get in the discussion. This is fascinating stuff. I really hope taking a little vacation this coming weekend from the 28th through the 31st. I'll be in Arizona for 4 days. I'm quite sure that's when the Seahawks are going to announce that they've hired a head coach. So I'll be bringing my laptop, maybe reporting to you from Sedona, Arizona, on my thoughts on the Seahawks coach's hire. But until then, thanks for supporting the show and watching and listening. I am Dan Viens. Forever and always, go Hawks.